Chapter 11. This time, their reunion-turned-hug only lasted for several moments. And once again, this time, it was Ed's fault. Roy felt Ed, still leaning against his side, Roy's arm clutched around his shoulders, start to tug at his wrist. Roy kept silent, but looked down in mild surprise, watching as Ed pulled his arm down to lie in his lap. Sure fingers prodding at it, turning it over, brushing against the healing scratches. At first, those marks were what he thought the kid was after, and he swallowed, trying to think of a response that didn't paint him as crazy.
Those are...
Then he stopped. Ed wasn't looking at the scratches. He was looking deeper than that, to the faint red impression marks on his arm, the strikingly unique patterns from how he'd been bound. The same marks, Roy now remembered, that Ed had had.
Oh,
Ed said after several moments, his fingers shaking over a particularly large mark around his wrist.
They did it to you, too.
Roy winced.
Yeah,
he said at length. Well, it wasn't as if he could hide it now. He swallowed dryly, suddenly intensely glad Ed had no idea about the gag and would never find out. Then just found himself awkwardly trying to defend the hospital, make it out to be not as bad as it seemed, as he knew Ed was starting to think.
To be fair, I don't think they really had a choice in my case. I wasn't exactly willing to listen to reason.
He eyed the bruises on Ed's face again, stomach somersaulting. His fault. It was his fault. He'd hurt Ed. But Ed just winced too, still not looking at him, still not seeming to even care about the marks on his face.
I'm sorry,
he muttered, hunching his shoulders.
I should have told you, so you'd, like you said, so you'd be prepared. Shut up, will you?
Roy sighed. He ruffled Ed's hair again, for the express purpose of annoying him, trying to get him to shake off some of the obvious guilt. It worked, but only part way, and Roy sighed again.
It's over now, and I survived it, didn't I?
He held off that Ed had obviously had it way worse than he had. Being in that room for weeks, and unlike Roy, actually hadn't fucking deserved it. And what was more, being coherent the whole time. Somehow, he figured that wouldn't go far towards cheering Ed up.
I'm fine now, so you've got no reason not to be fine either.
Ed muttered something under his breath, voice thick, and he ducked his head again, not letting Roy see as he lifted his hand up to rub at his face for a moment.
You're such a bastard,
he said at last, shoulders still hunched. But this time, Roy could hear the weak smile in his voice, and he knew he'd gotten through to him.
Guilty as charged.
He sighed, beaming, and reached a hand up to ruffle his hair again. This time Ed battered at his wrist, hissing, "Next time I bite that hand off, bastard!" And Roy couldn't help another weak smile, letting the arm fall down to his side and leaving the other around Ed's shoulders. This was what he had come back for. After several moments of peaceful silence, it somehow finally got through to him how cold the figure under his arms was. Not so chilled he had to be concerned, but cold enough, and Roy swallowed a momentary thrum of protective anger, arm tightening reflexively around his shoulders.
They did it to you again,
he said quietly, some of the relief fading from his voice to be eaten by anger instead. He knew he didn't have to specify for Ed to know he meant the ice bath. He reached down, still frowning, to grab the still warm blanket and wrap it around the both of them, pressing it around Ed's shoulders tightly as the kid gave him a distracted nod, still averting his eyes.
"They do a lot worse here, you know,"
he pointed out quietly, picking at some stray thread on his clothes with an absent-minded shrug. Roy gritted his teeth, fingers tightening again, and had to fight back another protective snap of, well, they shouldn't. Not to Fullmetal, anyway. He doesn't deserve it. You can hardly say the same for yourself, can you, Roy? But that didn't matter now, did it? Because Roy's intention was to get Ed out of here before they could do any of that to him again.
"Listen,"
he started after several moments, making to push Ed out to be held at arm's length so they could look at each other.
"Fullmetal, tonight we—"
"Why'd you do that, bastard?" he asked, running over the words without a second thought. Finally, for the first time, Fullmetal's fierce eyes actually lifted to meet his as he pushed at the arm around his shoulders, moving back to glare at him on his own. "Why'd you freak out like that?"
"I don't know what you're
"When I did what you did, when I skipped those pills?" Ed's eyes faded a little, darkening with memory, but they still held his own. Look, I won't lie and say it was fun, but it wasn't. I knew where I was. I could control myself. I was okay. You—" He hesitated, biting his lip quietly, as if he was just unable to help himself. "You weren't." And for the first time, Roy had nothing to say back to him. His mouth, still sore from the gag and sickened from all the drugs, went dry, and he suddenly found himself licking his lips, throat aching as he looked away.
"I don't know,"
he said stiffly, which was the most blunt and honest truth he could give. He didn't know why the drugs had affected him differently than Ed, and didn't really care either. But he knew that wasn't really what Ed was asking him. They both knew it. After a few awkward, uncomfortable moments passed in dead silence, Ed cleared his throat, nudging at Roy's hand again. "What you remembered?" He started hesitantly, then stopped. He shifted awkwardly on the bed again. "Whatever it was, I wouldn't put much stock in it. I mean, it was a drug-fueled hallucination, bastard. First and foremost, that's what it was. Yeah, sure, maybe there may have been some bits of truth in there, but there are probably lots more exaggerations and lies, so there's no point in moping about it now." Ed paused again, frowning at him. "That's the whole reason I told you not to do this in the first place." And again, Roy just looked away. Part of him knew that what Ed was saying had to be the truth. Everything he'd seen in that padded room, it all carried the ring of truth to it. But underneath that truth, well, he understood it couldn't all be real. Not unless Risa Hawkeye had followed him throughout his entire life as a creepy ghost and whispered why to him from every corner of every room. But he'd remembered enough that was true. He knew enough. And Roy hesitated as he glanced at the confident form in front of him again, the fierce, good-hearted boy who trusted him completely and was willing to do anything for him here, who was now bruised because of him. He thought of what he remembered now, of his blood-splattered screaming face, of Ed sitting in a wheelchair, limbs freshly lost, of what it meant that Roy had been there to see him like that, of how likely it was that he had been the one to do those things to him. He looked at Ed, and he opened his mouth, the words already collecting on his tongue, the admission of guilt, the apologies, the "I don't know what I did to you, but I know I'm the reason you don't have your arm and leg, and I'm sorry." The admittance of everything that he'd done wrong, and the horrifically inadequate apologies that could never, ever make up for what he'd done. It all grew in his throat and sat there on his tongue, and he opened his mouth to say it all to the innocent child he'd never done anything for but hurt. None of it came out. He couldn't get out any of it. And at last, Roy just looked away again, fists clenching in his lap, and buried the guilt back inside his heart.
I don't think I'm a good person, Fullmetal,
he said at last. It was far, far from the worst of what he could have said. It was so far from it, it was barely the truth at all.
I really don't.
But he knew he had to admit something to that boy now, at least. And it was still the truth. There was another moment of uncertain silence.
Well,
Ed said bluntly back,
I think you're wrong. And stupid.
Roy winced again, shutting his eyes as a violent shudder shook through him from head to toe. His vision clouded with the heat and screams of a nation, and the burning flesh of the woman he'd. I think I loved her, and I burned her.
Fullmetal, I don't think...
Roy sighed, breaking off to rub his hand over his face, trying not to look at the marks lining both his arms.
I'm telling the truth. I don't think I'm a good person. And I don't think alchemy is good either.
He made an effort to meet Ed's eyes again, trying to hold his gaze, trying to make him believe.
I know what you said, how you feel good when you do it. And I know you don't really have a choice while you're here. I understand you're just doing what you have to survive, but I don't think it's good. I don't think you should be doing it when we get out of here.
Ed's eyes widened incredulously, the kid leaning back from him to frown in disbelief.
What are you babbling about now? Alchemy's great. I mean, not what they're making me do with it, but you know what I mean.
All Roy could see, though, was the fires as he burned a country to the ground, and his array had done it. All Roy could see was the scratches and bruises he'd hit into Susan and Ed.
I'm just saying what I think,
he finished quietly, averting his eyes again.
Take it how you will.
Ed paused again, not cutting him off this time, actually taking him seriously. He was still for a few moments, looking away from him as well as he sobered, smile slipping into a more serious grimace.
I think alchemy's not good or bad, really. It's like everything else. It's just a tool. You can do good things or bad things. It depends on who's using it.
Ed gave him a slight grin, clearly one meant to reassure him as he reached a hand out, nudging at him again.
So yeah, it probably seems bad using it here for these assholes, but there's nothing inherently wrong with it. I bet we're both pretty kick-ass with it, when we get to use it however we actually want to.
It took Roy several moments to realize where Ed was coming from with this. When he finally did, he felt even worse than before. Ed thought he'd just used his alchemy to make gold here, for Justin. That was what he thought he was talking about. To Ed, that was where this sudden new reasoning had come from. He didn't know, had no idea. He doesn't know what you are. Roy swallowed thickly, his mouth tasting bitter and like poison, and squeezed his eyes shut again. He doesn't know what you've done. It was painfully quiet for several long moments, Roy unable to get another word past the thick guilt swimming in his stomach. Ed obviously aware something was going on, but not sure how best to intervene. At last, Ed gave him a harsh poke to the chest, prodding at him so hard Roy had to look at him again, and was met with steady, unwavering eyes and a ready grin.
Well, I think you're wrong. And stupid. Stupidly wrong, bastard. And, you know, this conversation is pointless regardless. Doesn't really matter if you're wrong or not, because right now, you're pretty much all that I've got. So I'd like it if you didn't make me feel like I was depending on a screw-up, thanks.
And he flashed another fierce, bold grin, one that felt miles too innocent and young to ever touch his black heart, but it did somehow. Even though Roy didn't believe him. Even though he was pretty sure he was much, much worse than a screw-up. Somehow it did. It felt a little bit like a lie when Roy managed to pull together a weak grin back at him. But it was necessary, because Ed was right. They were all each other had right now. And right now, they had something they had to do.
Well,
Roy said, clearing his throat, steadying his still slightly thick voice.
On that note, you want to try breaking out of this place?
He paused, offering him a crooked smile again.
Tonight?
Ed's face lit up like a light bulb, and for a moment was almost too small to contain his smile.
Thought you'd never ask.
There were things to arrange. Ripping up the sheets of notes Ed had been collecting, trying to erase any sign that their rooms had ever been occupied by anybody other than two drugged-out hospital patients. Scouting out the rest of the ward, making completely sure the route they planned to take that night was still clear, and that they were both sure on the plan. And then, of course, was the interminable waiting until actual nightfall, which was pretty bad, when neither of them could sit still. But it was bearable, because at last they'd be getting out of here.
You know, for what it's worth,
Ed asked, sitting back in his room waiting for the hours to pass, carefully shredding one of his sketches of the tattoos.
What we were talking about, trying to find the patient files. I actually went and did it when you, freaked out earlier. I got them.
Roy stopped in his own task, eyes widening.
You did what?
Ed shrugged, looking almost infuriatingly proud of himself.
Yeah. Everybody was focused on you, and I was too at first. But then I figured there was no better time than the present, was there?
Ed smirked, neatly ripping up another one of the pieces into even smaller shreds.
I snuck off and managed to find our patient files. Bastard, we're totally fucking right. About everything. There wasn't any mention of schizophrenia, treatments, none of that shit. They called us fucking test subjects. And there was this one thing. Protocols to keep subjects docile and productive were working. No part of it read like an actual legit patient file. We're totally fucking right. These people are psycho.
Roy swallowed a laugh in his throat, rolling his eyes.
You are too smart for your own good, I think,
he said, neatly ripping up his own sheets of notes to discard of. He grimaced after a moment, glancing back up at him.
So, managed to find anything actually useful in this little jaunt of yours? Did the files give you something helpful like, I don't know, a home address or...
Ed scowled angrily, and his next rip was so fast the papers almost hit the floor.
Well, excuse fucking me. I've got to do everything around here, apparently. Can't help yourself? Need little old me to do it for you now? Wait.
Roy leaned forward, holding his gaze with the most serious look that he could muster, fighting his smile back, even though it took just about all of his strength.
Wait, Fullmetal, this... Wow, I can't believe it. Have you actually admitted it now? Have you finally accepted it?
Ed stared at him like he'd sprouted a second head.
Accepted what, you asshole? Your reality.
He swallowed, trying to keep his voice steady, then just gave up as a tiny, proud smirk slipped through.
Of being little.
It took several moments for Ed to get it. When he finally did, the slow, furious reddening of his face, the way his eyes widened, and his mouth started to open to initiate the loudest rant of his life, was easily the best thing Roy had seen all week.
I can't believe I ever fucking missed you, you stupid son of a...
The door to his room slammed open. Laughter was still caught in Roy's chest, a smile on his face and hands shaking with suppressed mirth. He crumpled the sheets still in his hands on instinct alone, just too shaken and exhausted and relieved to be terrified anymore, as he started to turn back around to face it. Ed's rant had been stopped, but the kid was still red-faced and furious as he turned around, fists clenched, as they both shifted to face the intruder. For a few moments, Roy was still too out of it for him to really even grasp what was going on. It wasn't one of the nurses, which made this a first. They'd never seen anyone other than Anne or Susan in their tiny, locked ward. It was Justin, and some strangers behind him, which was completely unexpected and out of nowhere. But after however many weeks or months they'd spent here, never given the freedom to do anything but just accept what was happening to them, he'd lost the ability to really be horrified or stricken anymore. It took him a few seconds to manage to smother the grin from his face, trying to go for their usual drugged, sedated facade, listening as Ed did the same. And Justin just stood in the doorway and impassively looked at them.
Well,
the doctor said at last, folding his arms.
Here we are.
Roy paused, glancing between him and Ed, not surprised to find the kid just as out of it as he was. So, how were they supposed to respond to that?
Here you two are. I'm glad you're together. It'll save some time, although, somehow, I'm not very surprised.
Roy exchanged an uncertain glance with Ed. Again, he wasn't surprised to see that he obviously had no clue what was going on. Which was good, because Roy didn't either.
Allow me to explain,
Justin said coldly, impassive glare travelling between the two of them with absolutely none of the warmth or caring that had been there before. Sure, Roy had never believed it for a second, but at least the facade had been there. But now, there was nothing there but cold dislike and a steadily growing warning.
I met Roy earlier today, Edward,
Justin said, gesturing at him,
and something was odd about him, but I just couldn't put my finger on it at first. He seemed perfectly normal after all, acted just like you.
He took several small steps into the room, and the two men behind him followed. They were dressed like hospital staff, but somehow Roy got the feeling that they weren't nurses. He got the feeling they weren't here to help at all. Roy exchanged another nervous look with Ed, heart squeezing anxiously, and looked back to Justin. Slowly, tremulously, he started to get to his feet. He heard the kid do the same, even as Roy held an arm out just a little and moved to stand in front of him. Justin did not appear impressed. At all.
It wasn't until after you'd begged your way into getting me to let you leave, Roy,
he went on coldly,
that I realized you've been acting just like Edward here, acting as if you'd been sedated.
He took one more step forward, uncrossing his arms for one hand to fall down to his pocket, and the men behind him advancing still. His frown deepened.
Which I found especially odd, because I'd been following your treatment, Roy, and happened to know that you hadn't been given any sedatives for 4 days.
Roy blinked. Justin continued to glare, and then his heart dropped. Oh, shit.
Considering just how well your behavior matched Edward's, Roy,
he went on, a small, almost nasty smile starting to grow.
I wondered just how best to explain it, seeing as, well, Edward's been on sedatives every time I've met him, and you weren't.
He tilted his head, withdrawing his hand from his pocket, and that nasty smile grew.
Supposedly, anyway.
And he held out his hand. Roy's heart dropped again.
Care to explain this?
Justin asked coldly, rolling the dozen or so small white capsules around his palm.
These, and the 4 dozen more that I found where they came from?
The dozen or so skipped sedatives that they'd been hiding under the couch cushions ever since they'd come here.